Thank you first, Bristol, for the invitation to be here. Thank you, Stephen, for that great start to the afternoon. Slightly anxious here because my research isn't directly on human nature. I'm interested in natural kinds, and I'm interested in some aspects of humans and the kinds that they are found in. And what I'm going to do is to reflect on how the things I do know about might help us understand what's going on in this debate. Okay, so I'm interested in the idea of there being humankind, or I'm interested in what really an idea that start with Ian Hacking's work on humankind. Now, when I say humankind, people might think of ethnic groups or what was once called races and so forth, but actually the kinds that I've been thinking about following Ian Hacking are kinds like this, slightly more esoteric kinds. People with multiple personality disorder, or identity dissociation disorder. And looking at these kinds, and I'll discuss them more in a moment, might raises to me the question, if we can get a good account of there being distinct human kinds of people, might that shed light on whether there is such a thing as the human kind, and if so, what it's like, and whether it might be said to have some scientifically interesting characteristics. Okay, so let's start with a little story that gets into this picture. In 1982, police escorted a confused young man to a clinic in Daytona Beach in Florida. The young man, whose name was Eric, talked in two voices. One sounded rather infantile, childish, the other rather mature and adult. Over time, Eric revealed 27 distinct personalities, named, amongst others, Mark, Dwight, Jeffrey, Michael, and Philip. Others were Tina, a woman, and Cy, a religious mystic. Eric's alters, as these alternative personalities are known, would interact with one another. Eric liked classical music, but Michael, a fan of rock, hated Eric's music and ripped out the cables to Eric's stereo. Among those with multiple personality disorder, so they say dissociative identity disorder is sometimes known, Eric was relatively speaking unusual only in that he was a man. Most multiples are women. His number of distinct personalities, 27, is exactly average for American individuals with NPD at the time. Yes, average 27. The most famous, so the most multiples are women, and the most famous of these was one known as Sybil Isabel Dorset. Sybil is the name, or the fictionalized name of the true life, allegedly true life, of Shirley Ardell Mason. This 1973 book became an international bestseller. Two movies were made based on this book with that name, Sybil. Mason was Sybil was the patient of the psychiatrist, Dr. Cornelia Wilbur, and under Wilbur's treatment, Mason developed 16 personalities, both children and adults, women and men. Now, what seems to be interesting about multiple personality disorder is that it has shown distinct historical phases. So, although it was present in the 19th century, the condition then was known as double consciousness, and people with double consciousness tended to show, as the name suggests, just two distinct personalities, not 27 or however many. There was a further period in France when the notion of consciousness was exchanged for that we now have of personality. Now another period located more in the United States. And then after about the 1920s, cases of multiple personality disorder were relatively infrequent, and it was really only in the 1960s and 70s that multiple personality disorder showed itself again on the map. And what was distinctive about this relatively recent, or the last recurrence, was what made it possible was the connection made for the first time with child sexual abuse. And the latter had only itself become acknowledged as a widespread problem only in the late 60s and early 1970s. Mason and Sybil reported experiencing child sexual abuse from her mother as a child. Eric similarly had been a victim of sexual violence as a child. Multiple personality disorder was also characterized in this case by, as I said, many personalities, not just two, and Sybil provided a sort of paradigm of a multiple personality disorder case. So Hacking goes into some detail about this, and what was intriguing was that in the 1980s, when there were reports in the press about not just child abuse, but child satanic or ritual abuse, that this was all linked in with devil worship, and this was supposed to be very widespread, that at that point, patients reporting with multiple personality disorder reported very frequently that they had been the victims of child satanic abuse. Now, what's intriguing about that is that very few people now believe that there was any extensive, if any, satanic, devil-worshipping type of abuse, and that almost all of that is completely fictional, even though, so what are we to make of the fact that people with multiple personality disorder were reporting themselves as having experienced satanic abuse when it, in almost all cases, couldn't have actually occurred. So some critics said, look, the whole thing is made up. There's no multiple personality disorder. And indeed, there was some discussion of whether Sybil's story stood up to scrutiny. So there are distinct views about what's going on here. The psychiatrists investigating or treating cases felt there was a genuine disorder brought about by child abuse. Another view was that they're simply non-existent and exists only because the physicians who really believe in it make suggestions, consciously or unconsciously, to susceptible patients. Which of these are the two competing views? I mean, there is a view that makes out any social group to be purely sociological in the sense that if society thinks it exists, then it exists, and that's just all there is for something to exist. And I think that I won't dwell too much on that, but I think there is another way of looking at things, and this is to think that some human kinds are what one might call interactive kind, where there is a certain kind of interaction between the practice of classification and the people being classified. In science, we might just expect our classificatory practices just to respond to the way things are in the world. The way things are in the world are fixed, and hopefully we align our classificatory practices to them. But what is being suggested here is that there's an interaction between these two. So, So after the legalization of homosexuality in various countries where it had been illegal, in most Western countries, there was a difference in behaviour amongst the gay community as a result of legalization that meant that some of the behavioural practices that even homosexuals regarded as characteristic of their community changed. So, certain behaviours would be hidden or just not engaged in, but then with gay pride, then certainly people were very happy to mark themselves as being gay, and so certain kinds of behaviours came to exist and become characteristic, if not but not universal, of members of the gay community. But that can only happen because humans are able to think of themselves as belonging to a community, as being labelled in a certain way, or as labelling themselves in a certain way. Once upon a time, even philosophy professors had characteristic ways of behaving. Okay, I've chosen my favourite Finnish football team. I know you guys all follow the English Premier League, but I follow Finnish football. That there will be certain ways if you label yourselves as a supporter of this team or that team, that you will behave in a certain way, dress in a certain way, you go to matches, know various songs and so forth. So the practices of the way you behave may be influenced by your knowledge that you are being labelled in a particular way. It may encourage you to behave in one way that in these cases where you deliberately identify yourself as belonging to the group. In that case, it's obvious. Gay pride would be like that, but before legalization, the opposite would have been, or may have been, the case. Okay, so a third option, or an option in this debate, is to think that actually there's something in both of these. There's something in both of those that is correct. It's not as if everything about these is mutually exclusive. So you could imagine that what's going on is that there is genuine childhood trauma, and that this is a context-free psychological fact about these individuals, that they've gone through a trauma and that this has disturbed them. But the way that the trauma manifests itself is dependent upon the social context in which the individual finds themselves. And that in a context in which multiple personality disorder is a possible way of being, and one that the patient and their physician are both aware of, then that might be the way the trauma manifests itself. But if that's not available, then there may be different ways in which it might manifest itself. So it's a genuine state of, it's a genuine disorder, but one whose manifestation is socially determined. And so look, the thought might be that these kinds are genuinely real. They're not purely sociological. In case of NPD, there's real trauma and it's a real condition, even if some of its manifestations are sociologically fixed, or influenced rather. There's an interaction between cultural and non-cultural psychological characteristics. There's what one might call metaphysical contingency. There doesn't have to be this kind. There doesn't have to be a kind of people suffering from multiple personality disorder. It's historically contingent as well. It can vary over time, vary clearly over place as well. And we've got variation and lack of universality. There's no one way of being of suffering from a multiple personality disorder. For that matter, there's no one way of suffering from a trauma brought on by child abuse. Okay. So then the question is, might there be humankinds that, a humankind with a characteristics human nature that's like this? And I'm just quickly end up by saying why I think there might be. And I think this perhaps gives some sort of framework for thinking about the debate that Stephen was discussing. So our starting point, the default position, perhaps going back to Aristotle, or influenced by paradigms such as thinking about natural kinds such as the elements, gold, oxygen, and so forth, that these kinds that are associated with intrinsic essences, which are confusing, necessary and sufficient intrinsic properties. They're intrinsic properties. They're properties determined by the thing itself. They're necessary and sufficient, which means that each object has to have these properties if it's to be in that kind, and get all these properties together, then that's enough to make you in the kind, and it's necessarily that way. Gold is the same under all possibilities. Gold couldn't have been different from the way it is. What the problem is that for biological species, we find that we can't find these intrinsic essential properties. There aren't a set of properties such that all and only humans have them that are intrinsic. It's not a property about me that makes me human, and you and the rest of us. So there are two. If this is that's correct, then intrinsic human essences don't simply isn't the right story. But there are two ways you can go after this. One hasn't been mentioned yet, and I think it's worth discussing, and that's the idea that the essences are not going to be intrinsic. Then that's to say, it's not some feature about each individual human, some property of them that makes them a human. It's a relational property. That's to say, what makes someone a human, or a member of Homo sapiens, the species, is that they are descended from the Ur family of Homo sapiens. So it's a matter of having a line, being part of a certain line of descent that is characteristic of our species. And this is what those clades are. You can get an essence out of this, but it's a relational essence. Okay. But the alternative way to go, which is being more the subject of our discussion, and this is where Edouard Machery is going, is to say, well, no, we're still interested in intrinsic properties, but they're, well, you could just get rid of the essentialism and say impossible, but in fact people move further and say, look, we're talking about intrinsic properties that characterize the human nature, but they're not universal properties, they're sort of generic. What do I mean by generic? Generic statements are statements like this. Birds fly. Who's going to disagree with that? Of course birds fly, yes. But measles is an unpleasant disease. All sorts of statements that we make are generic, but generic statements can be regarded as true, yet have exceptions. Birds fly. Oh, but by the way, penguins don't. The fact that penguins don't fly doesn't mean it's false to say that birds fly. It means it's false to say that all birds fly. But if we put generic statements like birds fly can be true, even when there are exceptions. Okay. So this, I think, is roughly what Machery would be happy with. Okay, and this is what he calls the monological conception of human nature, in contrast to the essentialist view. But I think that really, actually, the essentialist conception is still viable, but what it's viable as is an account of what the species is, right? What it is to, and that tells us what it is to be a human. If you want to know whether an organism is a human being or not, you go to the right-hand side. Right? You ask, is this creature descended from that group of human beings? But then, if you want to ask, what are humans like? What are their characteristics? You go to the left-hand side, Machery's view, and that's, I haven't defended it, but that's where I think he's right in thinking that human nature is to be found on that side of things. But there is a relationship between the two, which is that the fact that we have this shared or this common descent given on the right-hand side is part of, but only part of, the explanation for what's going on the left-hand side. But of course, when we're interested in kinds and explanations involving the properties of kinds, we have to ask ourselves, which bit of science are we interested in? And I don't think that the principal area where appeal to human nature, understood in this way, is going to be of use is in the social and behavioural sciences. Because, as Stephen rightly says, the social and behavioural sciences are interested in explaining variation within the species. But when you're trying to explain variation, what you're not going to appeal to as being of primary interest is what all of those things, or most of them, or a good proportion of them, have in common. Your explanations are going to appeal to what's different amongst them. So this is only going to be of interest when we are interested in looking at differences not between humans, but between humans and other things. Right? And I think that's where, if you do want a concept of human nature to do some work, it's not going to be in the human behavioural and social sciences, it's going to be in zoology, right? It's going to be in looking at human beings as a kind of animal. Right? And for example, in primatology, humans and chimpanzees have many things in common, but we have quite a lot of things that we don't have in common with them, both phenotypically and behaviourally and socially. They are also social beings, but of a different kind, as likewise the other great apes. Human nature will, if it does any job work at all, will come into explaining differences not within humans, but between humans and other species.